The red light blinked on Daniel's wrist communicator, signaling the start of the transmission. He tapped the screen, and a calm but firm voice filled the small chamber. "Daniel, remember your mission. The Exarathians are not our enemies, but they are not our friends either. We must respect their traditions. Do not interfere, no matter what you see. The peace between our species depends on it." Daniel sighed and rubbed his temple. "Understood," he replied, though the words felt heavy on his tongue. The message ended, leaving him alone in the quiet chamber of his landing pod. Through the reinforced glass, he could see the volcanic landscape of Exarath Prime. Rivers of molten lava carved their way through jagged black rocks, and thick smoke rose from the cracks in the ground. It was a world built on fire, just like its people, strong, proud, and unyielding. Daniel checked his gear one last time. A translator device on his wrist, a compact energy shield in case of emergencies, and a formal diplomatic badge displayed on his chest. No weapons. The Exarathians considered it an insult if a guest carried one. The pod door hissed open, releasing a wave of heat. Daniel stepped out, his boots crunching against the hardened lava beneath him. A group of armored Exarathians waited ahead, their tall, muscular forms standing like statues against the burning sky. Their leader, Rovan, stepped forward. His golden armor reflected the firelight, and his sharp eyes studied Daniel carefully. "Human," Rovan said in a deep voice. "You are late." Daniel gave a polite nod. "I wanted to make sure I was prepared. I appreciate the invitation to witness your great ceremony." Rovan grunted, his expression unreadable. "Follow me." Daniel walked beside him as they moved toward the towering fortress in the distance. The heat of the lava streams nearby made the air shimmer. But the Exarathians didn't seem to notice. Their thick skin and natural endurance made them nearly immune to the extreme temperatures. Inside the fortress, the walls were carved from dark stone, decorated with ancient symbols glowing faintly with heat. Massive torches lined the halls, casting flickering shadows. The scent of burning metal filled the air. They entered a grand chamber where a crowd of Exarathians had gathered. At the center, a wide pit of bubbling lava glowed fiercely, sending waves of heat into the room. Chains dangled above the pit, and at the end of those chains, a girl. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. She was young, probably in her early teens, her silver-blue skin marked with ceremonial paint. Her wrists and ankles were bound by thick metal shackles, and her eyes, wide, frightened, darted around the room. "What is this?" Daniel asked, keeping his voice calm, though his stomach twisted. "The trial of strength," Rovan replied. "She is to prove herself worthy. If she survives until the chains burn away, she will join the warrior caste. If she does not, she was never meant to be one of us." Daniel swallowed hard. His orders echoed in his mind. "Do not interfere." He forced himself to remain still as the drums began to beat, signaling the start of the trial. The girl clenched her fists, her breathing quick. Below her, the lava bubbled hungrily. Daniel's heart pounded. He had seen many cultures, many traditions. Some were harsh, but this was different. Could he really stand by and do nothing? The drums echoed through the chamber, a deep, steady rhythm that matched the pounding in Daniel's chest. The heat from the lava pit made the air thick, heavy, difficult to breathe. Sweat trickled down his back, but he barely noticed. His eyes were locked on the girl hanging above the molten fire. Her silver-blue skin shimmered with sweat, and her arms trembled as she clutched the chains that held her above the pit. The metal links were already glowing red-hot, weakening with every passing second. The Exarathians around him stood silent, watching with focused intensity. To them, this was not cruelty. It was a sacred test. Strength meant survival. Weakness meant failure. And failure meant death. Daniel's fists clenched at his sides. "Do not interfere." The words repeated in his head like a warning alarm. He had been sent here as an observer, a diplomat. The fragile peace between humanity and the Exarathians depended on him respecting their traditions. If he acted against them, he could start a conflict that humanity was not prepared to face. But his gut twisted at the sight of the girl struggling to hold on. She was just a child. Her breathing was fast, her fingers slipping on the heated metal. She wouldn't last long. A sharp voice pulled him from his thoughts. "She will fall soon," Rovan said beside him, his expression unreadable. "If she is worthy, she will endure." Daniel turned to the warrior leader. "And if she doesn't?" Rovan's gaze didn't waver. "Then she was never meant to be among us." Daniel swallowed hard. His mind raced, searching for a way out of this. The girl's eyes darted around the room, desperate, searching for help. But she found none. The warriors around her stood motionless, their faces hard, their hearts unwilling to show mercy. Then, for just a second, her gaze met Daniel's. He saw it clearly. Fear, but not just fear. A plea. A silent cry for someone, anyone, to save her. His pulse pounded in his ears. The chains cracked. A gasp ran through the crowd. The metal links holding her wrists had weakened under the heat. One more second, maybe two, and the chain snapped. The girl screamed as she plummeted toward the lava. Daniel moved before he could think. His hand shot to his wrist device. With a flick of his fingers, he activated his energy grappler, a small, nearly invisible force tether designed for emergencies. A blue beam shot out, wrapping around the girl's waist just before she could hit the molten fire. The chamber erupted in chaos. Gasps, shouts, and roars of anger filled the room as Daniel yanked her away from the pit. The girl dangled in the air for a moment before he pulled her toward him, catching her in his arms. She was shaking, breathing fast, her body weak from exhaustion, but she was alive. Daniel barely had a moment to register that fact before a heavy silence fell over the chamber. Every Xarathian warrior was staring at him. Their glowing eyes burned with fury. Rovan took a slow step forward. His jaw was tight, his expression dark. "You have broken our sacred law." Daniel's heart pounded. "I saved her life." "You dishonored her," Rovan growled. His voice was low, dangerous. "She was meant to prove her strength. You took that from her. You have insulted our ways." The girl in Daniel's arms barely moved. She was still breathing hard, her small hands gripping his jacket as if she was afraid he would let her go. Daniel looked down at her, then back at the warriors surrounding him. His mind screamed at him to find a way out, a way to calm the storm that was about to explode. But deep down, he knew. There was no going back now. The air in the chamber was thick with tension. Every Xarathian warrior had their eyes locked on Daniel, their hands tightening into fists. The girl trembled in his arms, too weak to stand on her own. Daniel's mind raced. He had broken their law, insulted their traditions, and interfered in their sacred trial. He had done exactly what he was ordered not to do. Rovan took another step forward. His golden armor gleamed in the firelight, his face carved from stone. "You have made a grave mistake, human." His voice was calm, but beneath it was something dark, something dangerous. Daniel swallowed hard. "I couldn't let her die." Rovan's jaw tightened. "That was not your decision to make." The crowd around them stirred, whispering in their deep, guttural language. Some looked furious, others looked uncertain. The air smelled of burning metal, sweat, and something worse, the sharp scent of impending violence. A deep horn suddenly blared through the chamber, shaking the very walls. Rovan's gaze flicked to the entrance, then back to Daniel. His expression hardened. "The High Council will decide your fate," Rovan said. "You will come with us." Daniel took a step back, holding the girl close. "And if I refuse?" Rovan's eyes narrowed. "Then you will die here." Daniel had his answer. He had no choice. His grip tightened around the girl. He tapped his wrist device, activating a second function on his energy grappler, a short-range repulsion burst. The air shimmered. Then, with a sudden boom, a shockwave blasted outward, knocking back the nearest warriors. They stumbled, caught off guard for just a second. A second was all Daniel needed. He turned and ran. The girl in his arms was light, but exhaustion dragged at his limbs. His feet pounded against the stone floor as he sprinted toward the nearest corridor. The chamber exploded into noise behind him. Shouts, roars, the clatter of weapons being drawn. Daniel didn't stop. He didn't look back. The fortress halls were a twisting maze of dark stone, lined with massive torches that flickered in the smoky air. Heat pressed against his skin, making every breath feel heavy. The girl stirred weakly in his arms. "Why?" she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel didn't have time to answer. A group of warriors appeared ahead, blocking the passage. Their massive frames cast long shadows on the walls. Daniel skidded to a halt, his mind working fast. He spotted a side passage to the right, narrow, unguarded. His only chance. He darted toward it. A spear whistled through the air. Daniel ducked just in time, feeling the sharp wind of the weapons passing. It clattered against the stone behind him, sparks flying. He pushed forward, his legs burning. The side passage led downward, deeper into the fortress. The walls were rougher here, less polished. The heat grew stronger, the air thicker. Another turn, another long corridor, and then a dead end. Daniel cursed under his breath. His heart pounded in his chest as he turned back, searching for another way. Footsteps echoed behind him. The warriors were coming. The girl in his arms stirred again. "There, secret path," she whispered. Daniel's head snapped toward her. "Where?" She weakly raised a hand, pointing toward the stone wall to their left. At first, Daniel saw nothing, but then he noticed faint markings carved into the rock, almost invisible in the dim light. He shifted the girl to one arm and reached out, pressing against the stone. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a low grind, the wall slid open, revealing a hidden tunnel. Daniel didn't hesitate. He stepped inside just as the warriors rounded the corner behind him. The last thing he saw before the wall sealed shut was Rovin's piercing gaze, cold, unreadable. Daniel exhaled, his pulse still racing. He had escaped for now, but he knew this was far from over. The stone door sealed shut behind them with a heavy thud, plunging the tunnel into near darkness. Only a faint red glow from the molten cracks in the rock illuminated the narrow path ahead. The air was thick with heat, and the walls felt alive, pulsing with the warmth of the lava flowing deep below. Daniel pressed a hand against the wall, steadying himself. His breath was heavy, his heart still pounding from the escape. He looked down at the girl in his arms. She was weak, her silver blue skin slick with sweat. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes half open. He needed to get her to safety, fast. "You said this was a secret path," Daniel said, his voice low. "Where does it lead?" The girl swallowed hard before whispering. "To the outer cliffs, a way out." Daniel exhaled, adjusting his grip on her. He didn't know if he could trust her completely, but right now she was his only guide. He moved forward, his boots crunching against the rough stone floor. The tunnel twisted and turned, leading deeper into the fortress's foundations. The walls were lined with ancient carvings, worn down by time. Some depicted great battles. Others showed warriors standing over lava pits, watching as their own people were tested. Daniel's jaw tightened. How many had fallen into those flames before her? Behind them, a distant boom echoed through the tunnels. Daniel tensed. "They found the entrance," he muttered. The girl stirred in his arms. "They will follow." Daniel knew she was right. The Exarathians were strong, fast, and relentless. They wouldn't stop hunting him until he was caught or dead. He picked up his pace, ignoring the burn in his legs. The tunnel sloped upward now, the air growing slightly cooler. Suddenly, the girl stirred again. "Wait," she whispered. Daniel froze. She weakly pointed ahead. He followed her gaze and saw it. A faint shimmer in the air, barely noticeable in the dim light. "A trap," she said, her voice barely above a breath. Daniel narrowed his eyes. He carefully picked up a small rock from the ground and tossed it forward. The moment it crossed the invisible barrier, a burst of energy erupted, vaporizing the rock instantly. The air sizzled where the stone had been. Daniel let out a slow breath. That would have been bad. He scanned the edges of the tunnel. There had to be a way around it. His eyes caught a small opening in the rock near the floor, a tight crawl space just big enough for a human. He knelt down and placed the girl gently against the wall. "Can you crawl?" She nodded weakly, determination flickering in her tired eyes. Daniel went first, squeezing through the narrow gap. The stone was rough against his arms, and the heat made it feel like he was crawling through an oven, but he pushed forward. After a few grueling moments, he emerged on the other side. The girl followed, slower, struggling with each movement. Daniel reached out and pulled her through the last part, lifting her into his arms again. Another distant boom echoed behind them. The warriors were getting closer. Daniel gritted his teeth and pushed forward. Finally, the tunnel opened into a vast cavern. A narrow stone bridge stretched over a deep chasm, glowing lava bubbling far below. At the far end of the bridge, a jagged opening revealed the outside world, a fiery sky, and the distant peaks of the volcanic cliffs. "That's it," Daniel breathed. But before he could take another step, a loud clang rang out behind him. He turned sharply. Rovan stood at the tunnel entrance, his golden armor glowing in the firelight. Behind him, several warriors blocked the path. Their weapons gleamed, and their eyes burned with fury. Daniel's stomach dropped. There was nowhere left to run. Daniel tightened his grip on the girl as he stepped onto the narrow stone bridge. His eyes locked onto Rovan, who stood tall at the entrance of the cavern, his golden armor gleaming in the firelight. Behind him, a group of Exarethian warriors blocked the only way back. Their faces were hard, their glowing eyes filled with fury. There was no way out except forward, across the bridge, toward the distant opening that led outside. But the bridge was thin, barely wide enough for one person. Below it, molten lava churned, waiting to claim anyone who made a single wrong step. Rovan took a slow step forward. "You cannot escape, human." His voice was calm, but there was something dangerous beneath it. "You have broken our laws. You have insulted our traditions. There is only one path left for you. Surrender." Daniel's heart pounded. "I didn't come here to start a fight," he said. "I only wanted to save her." Rovan's eyes flicked to the girl in Daniel's arms. Her breathing was weak, but she was still awake, watching everything with wide, uncertain eyes. "You have shamed her," Rovan said. "She was meant to prove her strength. Now she will be seen as weak forever." Daniel shook his head. "She's just a child. She shouldn't have to prove her worth by dying." Rovan's expression darkened. "That is not for you to decide." The warriors behind him shifted, gripping their weapons. Daniel knew they wouldn't wait much longer. He took a slow step back onto the bridge, keeping his eyes on Rovan. "I don't want to fight you." Rovan's gaze remained steady. Then, to Daniel's surprise, the warrior reached for his own belt and unclipped his weapon, a long, curved energy blade. He turned it on, and the blue-white glow cast sharp shadows across his face. "You will not fight them," Rovan said. "You will fight me." Daniel's stomach dropped. He had seen Sarathians fight before. They were fast, powerful, and deadly. He didn't stand a chance in a one-on-one battle, especially while carrying the girl. He hesitated. "And if I refuse?" "Then we take the girl back," Rovan said simply. "And you will not leave this place alive." Daniel's jaw tightened. He looked at the girl, her tired eyes, her frail body. If he lost, she would go back to the people who had nearly let her die. His fists clenched. He had no choice. Slowly, he set the girl down at the edge of the bridge. She looked up at him, fear in her gaze. "You don't have to do this," she whispered. Daniel gave her a small, reassuring smile. Yes, I do. Then he turned to face Rovan. The warrior stepped onto the bridge, moving with slow confidence. His energy blade hummed softly in the heated air. Daniel took a deep breath. He had no weapon, no armor, no real chance of winning. But he wasn't going to back down. Rovan lunged. Daniel barely dodged in time. The blade slashed through the air where he had been standing a second ago. The bridge was narrow. There was almost no space to move. Rovan attacked again, swinging his blade in a deadly arc. Daniel ducked low, feeling the heat of the energy weapon pass just above his head. He couldn't fight Rovan with strength. He had to use speed, strategy, his only advantage. He feinted left, then suddenly stepped right, forcing Rovan to adjust his stance. Then, in a split second, Daniel kicked at Rovan's knee. It wasn't enough to injure him, but it made him stumble slightly. Daniel saw his chance. He grabbed Rovan's wrist, twisting hard. The energy blade flickered as Rovan's grip loosened. But before Daniel could disarm him, Rovan spun, using his greater strength to throw Daniel backward. Daniel barely caught himself, his feet skidding dangerously close to the edge of the bridge. One more wrong move, and he would fall into the lava below. Rovan straightened, gripping his weapon again. His eyes held something new, respect. "You fight well," he admitted, "but you cannot win." Daniel wiped sweat from his brow. His breathing was heavy, his body aching. He knew Rovan was right. He wouldn't last much longer. But then he glanced at the girl, who was watching with wide eyes, and an idea sparked in his mind. He turned back to Rovan, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I don't need to win." Before Rovan could react, Daniel suddenly jumped back, off the bridge. A collective gasp filled the cavern. But Daniel didn't fall into the lava. He had activated his energy grappler at the last second, the blue tether latching onto the stone above. He swung beneath the bridge, using the momentum to launch himself back up, this time behind Rovan. Before the warrior could turn, Daniel grabbed him by the arm and used his own strength against him. With one powerful motion, he flipped Rovan off balance. Rovan's foot slipped. His arms flailed. And then, with a final desperate grasp, he caught the edge of the bridge, dangling above the molten lava. The cavern fell silent. Daniel stood over him, breathing hard. Rovan's fingers clutched the stone tightly, his golden armor reflecting the fiery glow below. For the first time, real uncertainty flickered in the warrior's eyes. Daniel could let him fall. He could end this fight now. But he didn't. Instead, he knelt down and reached out his hand. Rovan stared at him, stunned. "You said strength is everything," Daniel said. "Then prove it. Prove you have the strength to change." For a long moment, Rovan didn't move. Then, slowly, he reached up and took Daniel's hand. Daniel tightened his grip as he pulled Rovan up from the edge of the bridge. The warrior's golden armor was heavy, but Daniel used every bit of his strength to lift him back onto solid ground. Rovan landed on his knees, breathing hard. His fingers dug into the stone, his face unreadable. The other warriors stood frozen at the entrance of the cavern. They had witnessed everything, how Daniel had saved their leader instead of letting him fall. Daniel stepped back, keeping his eyes on Rovan. His heart was still racing, but he stood tall. "I could have let you die," he said, "but I didn't." Rovan slowly lifted his head. His glowing eyes studied Daniel, searching for something. Behind them, the girl watched silently, her silver-blue skin still pale from exhaustion. Daniel took a slow breath. "You call this strength," he said, gesturing to the warriors. "This endless testing, this fighting. But real strength isn't about proving you're the strongest. It's about knowing when to protect instead of destroy." The cavern was silent except for the distant bubbling of lava below. Rovan exhaled, his jaw tight. Then, without a word, he stood up. He turned to his warriors, his face still unreadable. Daniel tensed. Was Rovan about to attack again? call for his men to finish the fight. Instead, Rovan did something unexpected. He dropped his weapon. The curved energy blade clattered against the stone, the sound echoing through the cavern. The warriors at the entrance shifted uneasily. They had never seen their leader yield before. Rovan's gaze moved to the girl. He studied her, then looked at the chains that still dangled from her wrists. Finally, he turned back to Daniel. "You have changed the path of fate today, human," he said, his voice quieter now. "I do not know if this is for the better, but I will not stand in your way." Daniel blinked. For the first time, it seemed like Rovan was questioning the very laws he had followed his whole life. The girl stepped forward, her voice weak but steady. "Will you let us go?" Rovan hesitated. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Go." A murmur ran through the warriors, but none dared to challenge Rovan's command. Daniel didn't waste another second. He picked up the girl and turned toward the exit. The sunlight beyond the cavern entrance was dim, but it was real. It was freedom. As he stepped onto the final stretch of the stone bridge, he paused and glanced back at Rovan. "You have a choice," Daniel said. "You can keep following the old ways, or you can make a new path." Rovan didn't answer, but something in his eyes had changed. Daniel didn't wait for more. He carried the girl across the last steps and out of the cavern, stepping into the burning light of the volcanic cliffs. For the first time since this all began, they were free. Daniel stepped out of the cavern and into the open world. The volcanic cliffs stretched before him, a landscape of jagged rocks, rivers of molten lava, and thick black smoke rising into the fiery sky. The air was heavy with heat, making every breath feel like it was burning his lungs. The girl in his arms stirred slightly, her silver blue skin glistening with sweat. She was weak but alive. That was all that mattered. Daniel scanned the cliffs. He needed to find shelter, a safe place where he could rest and figure out his next move. His ship was still far beyond the mountains, hidden in the wastelands. Getting there wouldn't be easy, especially with the girl in such a fragile state. Behind them, the cavern entrance remained open. Rovan and his warriors had not followed. Maybe they wouldn't. Maybe, for the first time, the Exarathians were questioning their ways. Daniel didn't have time to think about that now. He adjusted his grip on the girl and started moving, stepping carefully along the uneven ground. The volcanic terrain was treacherous, with cracks in the stone revealing deep pools of glowing lava. Every step had to be precise. The girl stirred again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you save me?" Daniel glanced down at her. "Because it was the right thing to do." She was silent for a long moment, then said, "No one has ever broken the trial before." Daniel sighed. "Then maybe it's time for things to change." They walked in silence for a while, the heat pressing against them from all sides. Every few minutes, Daniel checked behind him, making sure they weren't being followed. So far, the warriors had kept their word, but something else was bothering him. They weren't alone in this place. Daniel had spent enough time on alien worlds to recognize the signs, subtle movements in the distance, the way the lava pools rippled as if disturbed by something beneath the surface. Something was watching them. Daniel's muscles tensed. He needed to move faster. But before he could take another step, the ground beneath him shifted. A deep, rumbling sound echoed through the cliffs. The girl's eyes fluttered open in alarm. What was that? Daniel didn't answer. He already knew. The Skelgur had found them. From the shadows of the cliffs, massive figures emerged, four-legged creatures with thick, armored hides that shimmered like molten rock. Their glowing eyes locked onto Daniel and the girl, their mouths opening to reveal rows of jagged teeth. Daniel cursed under his breath. This just keeps getting better. The Skelgur were lava hunters. They thrived in the heat, blending perfectly into their surroundings. And now, they had marked Daniel and the girl as prey. One of the creatures let out a low, rumbling growl and took a step forward. The ground trembled beneath its weight. Daniel took a slow step back. Running wasn't an option. Not in this terrain, not with the girl in his arms. He had to think. Fast. His eyes darted to the surrounding cliffs. There, a narrow rock formation leading to higher ground. If he could get there, maybe he could outmaneuver them. The lead Skelgur lunged. Daniel moved. He tightened his hold on the girl and sprinted toward the rock formation. The ground shook as the creature landed where he had been just seconds ago. Daniel climbed, his fingers gripping the hot stone. The girl clung to him weakly, her breathing shallow. The Skelgur roared in frustration, clawing at the rock below. But they were too large to follow through the narrow passage. For now, they were safe. Daniel exhaled, his chest heaving. But deep down, he knew this was far from over. Daniel pressed his back against the hot stone, his breath coming in sharp gasps. His arms ached from carrying the girl, and sweat dripped down his face. Below, the Skelgur growled, pacing near the base of the rock formation. Their glowing eyes followed his every move. The girl stirred in his arms. Her silver-blue skin was warm, and her breathing was still weak. She needed water, rest, a safe place. But there was no time for any of that now. Daniel glanced at the cliffs ahead. The path was narrow and uneven, but if he could keep moving, he might be able to reach the other side of the mountain, closer to where his ship was hidden. One step at a time, he adjusted his grip on the girl and climbed higher. The rocks beneath his boots were loose, shifting slightly with every step. The heat from the lava below made the air shimmer, distorting the path ahead. A sudden crack echoed through the cliffs. Daniel froze. A large piece of rock crumbled beneath him, tumbling down into the depths below. The Skelgur roared as debris rained down, but they didn't leave. They were waiting for him to make a mistake. Daniel swallowed hard. He could not fall. With slow, steady movements, he continued forward, placing each step carefully. The girl's voice was faint. "They are still following." "Yes," Daniel muttered, "but they can't climb up here." She was silent for a moment. Then she whispered, "They don't need to." Daniel's stomach dropped. Before he could ask what she meant, a deep rumble shook the cliffs. His eyes widened as he looked ahead. From the other side of the rock formation, more Skelgur were climbing up, blocking the exit. Daniel's mind raced. He was trapped. He turned his head, scanning his surroundings. Think. There had to be a way out. Then he saw it. To the right, just beyond the approaching Skelgur, there was a natural rock bridge leading to another part of the cliffs. If he could reach it, he might be able to escape. But there was a problem. The bridge was unstable. The rocks looked weak, like they could collapse at any moment. Still, it was the only chance he had. Daniel tightened his grip on the girl. "Hold on." Then he ran. The Skelgur roared in surprise as Daniel leaped onto the rock bridge. The structure shook beneath him, but he didn't stop. He sprinted across, the girl clinging to him as tightly as she could. Behind him, the Skelgur charged after them. Their massive bodies made the bridge tremble with each step. Daniel pushed forward. Almost there. Almost. Crack! The bridge collapsed. Daniel jumped. For a heart-stopping moment, he was in freefall. Then, his hands found the edge of a ledge. He grunted as he slammed against the rock, his fingers barely gripping the rough surface. The girl gasped, her arms tightening around his neck. Below, the broken remains of the bridge fell into the lava, taking the Skelgur with it. Their roars of rage turned into cries of defeat as they disappeared into the molten abyss. Daniel gritted his teeth and pulled himself up. His muscles screamed in protest, but he refused to let go. With a final effort, he climbed onto solid ground. For a long moment, he just lay there, breathing hard. The girl was still in his arms, shaken but alive. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with something unreadable. "You saved me." Again. Daniel let out a breathless chuckle. "Yeah, that seems to be a habit now." The girl was silent. Then, softly, she said, No one has ever fought for me like this. Daniel sat up, his expression serious. Then maybe it's time someone did. He looked at the horizon. The mountain peaks were near. His ship was close. But something told him the real challenge was still ahead. Daniel stood on the edge of the rocky cliff, looking at the horizon. In the distance, beyond the burning rivers of lava and jagged mountains, his ship was waiting. Almost there. The girl in his arms stirred weakly. Her silver-blue skin was still pale, her breathing shallow, but there was more strength in her eyes now. "You all right?" Daniel asked. She nodded slightly. "Tired, but I can walk." Daniel hesitated. He didn't want to let her go just yet, but she had already been through so much. Gently, he helped her stand. She swayed for a moment but steadied herself. For the first time, she wasn't just someone he had rescued. She was standing beside him. "We need to move," Daniel said. "My ship is just past that ridge." She looked at the towering cliffs ahead. "Will they follow?" Daniel glanced back. The Skelgur were gone, lost to the lava below. The Exarathian warriors had not pursued them. For now, they were alone. "I don't think so," he said, "but we shouldn't wait to find out." They started walking. The volcanic heat was unforgiving, and every step across the rocky terrain was slow. But Daniel pushed forward, keeping his body between the girl and any danger. After what felt like hours, they reached the top of the ridge. And there it was, Daniel's ship. A sleek, dark gray vessel with reinforced plating, resting in the wasteland beyond the mountains. His escape. Their escape. The girl's eyes widened. "You really are leaving this world?" Daniel nodded. "And I'm taking you with me." She hesitated. "But where will I go?" Daniel sighed. He had been thinking about this the whole way. She couldn't go back to the Exarathians, not after what they had done. But the universe was vast. There were places where she could be free, where she could have a new life. "You'll be safe," he promised. "We'll find a place where you don't have to fight to survive." She looked down at her hands, once bound by chains. "I don't know what life without the trials is like." Daniel gave a small smile. "Then it's time to find out." They made their way down the ridge, toward the ship. Daniel activated his wrist console, sending a signal to power up the engines. The ship's lights flickered to life, and the boarding ramp slowly lowered. They had made it. But just as they reached the ramp, a shadow moved behind them. Daniel spun around. Rovan, the Exarathian warrior, stood at the top of the ridge, his golden armor gleaming in the light of the lava. He had followed them. The girl tensed beside Daniel. Rovan stepped forward, his face unreadable. His weapon was still on his belt, but he didn't reach for it. Daniel narrowed his eyes. "If you've come to stop us, you're too late." Rovan didn't speak at first. Then, after a long pause, he said, "She was never meant to leave." Daniel moved in front of the girl. "She's not a prisoner anymore." Rovan's gaze shifted to the girl. "You would lead your people." She lifted her chin. "I was never one of you." For the first time, something like regret flashed in Rovan's eyes. He exhaled slowly. "The elders will not forget this." Daniel smirked. "Let them try." Rovan stared at him for a long moment. Then, to Daniel's surprise, he stepped aside. "I will not stop you," Rovan said. "But if you take her, you take responsibility. The universe is not kind to the weak." Daniel nodded. "Then it's a good thing she's not weak." The girl glanced at Rovan one last time, then turned toward the ship. Daniel followed her up the ramp, his heart pounding as the doors sealed shut behind them. As he sat in the pilot's seat, he looked at the girl beside him. She was watching the controls, fascinated yet uncertain. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes." The engines roared to life. And as the ship lifted off, soaring into the endless sky, Daniel knew this was just the beginning. The end.